Good morning, everybody, and welcome to video number 3 in series number 2 of our GMAT Club GMAT videos. My name is Charles Bibelos, GMAT tutor at GMATninja.com, also GMAT Club's resident verbal expert. Before we launch in, let's talk a little bit about where we've been so far in these videos, where we're headed today. So first series, we did about 10 videos last year. All verbal videos, mostly sentence correction, a little bit of critical reasoning mixed in there. Didn't touch reading comprehension with a 10-foot pole because it doesn't necessarily make the best video content. Today, we're going to remedy that. We're going to go through a whole reading comp passage, not a super long one, not the sexiest thing. This isn't going to be for everybody. If reading comprehension is not a struggle for you, you might want to fast forward to the critical reasoning that we'll be talking about in the second half of today's webinar. What we've done so far in this series, so this is an 8-video series called Developing a Winning GMAT Mindset. So these are obviously free videos, but we're not really Santa Claus. So these aren't going to be the most satisfying thing. We're not just going to fill up your empty heads with formulas. These are all kind of things about how you tweak your mindset, how you change your habits of mind to be better at taking the GMAT, be better at quantitative reasoning and verbal reasoning, be better at finding ways to optimize your own performance. So our first video was on how to be your own GMAT tutor, talked about kind of the big picture of what you need to think about in terms of study plans, what kind of habits you develop day to day. Second video, we talked about how cutting corners on all 5 answer choices can kill your score. If you get sloppy, it'll absolutely eat you alive. The most common source of disappointing scores on the GMAT. Now today, we're going to talk about the 7 most common errors we see on critical reasoning and reading comprehension. And I think we build this as the 5 most common mistakes. I'm actually going to give you 7 things that we see the most often. Now, all 7 of these things actually cut across both reading comprehension and critical reasoning. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to briefly introduce all 7 of these, talk about them very, very briefly. Then we'll go through a full reading comprehension passage together. Only 2 of the questions for it in the interest of time. And then we'll go through 2 critical reasoning passages. So again, for those of you who really don't want to spend half an hour on a single reading comprehension passage, please go ahead and fast forward to the critical reasoning towards the end, because I know this can be tedious, especially if you've seen this passage before. That's part of why we've held back on doing this until video number 13 is we know that it can be a little bit unsexy to go through a reading comprehension passage. We do get the request quite a bit. We want to see how to do reading comprehension right. How do you think about it? How does a top scorer think about reading comprehension? That's what we're going to go through today. One last thing before we jump into the 7 things you're most likely to do wrong on reading comp and critical reasoning, please hit that subscribe button. And we are working on a new video series. So after we finish this one, we've got 5 more videos after today. Then we're working on a video series where we're going to interview people about their experiences in MBA programs. And the theme of these videos is going to be what MBA programs are really like. So before you enter those programs, there's the perception of what you're getting when you go to a top business school. So this is what Tuck is like, and this is the culture at Booth, or this is the culture at MIT. We're actually going to interview students or former students who are willing to really talk about what surprised them, what didn't surprise them, the good things, the bad things, tell you all about the warts and the wonderful things and the less wonderful things at their business schools. So that's coming up in April. Hit that subscribe button and you'll automatically see updates as we get those ready to go. All right, back to reading comp and critical reasoning. So 7 things that we see the most often, and all of these things overlap both critical reasoning and reading comprehension. First thing, we actually meet people all the time who say, yeah, I skim parts of the reading comprehension passage. Well, if you're shooting for an elite score, that absolutely will not work. There's a lot of mythology out there. Oh, if I just read the first paragraph and the last paragraph, I can skip the one in the middle and it'll be okay. Or if I read the first sentence of the paragraph, I can skim the rest of the paragraph and it's going to be okay. Nope, it's not going to be okay. Don't skim. Horrible myth, don't do it. You could think of that as under reading. If you're reading without enough intensity or without enough attention to detail, obviously you can miss key things that could cause trouble. Other side of that coin, reason number 2 why you're not quite meeting your ceiling on reading comp and critical reasoning, detail obsession. And we've already talked about this a little bit in some of the past videos. If you let your reading comprehension or critical reasoning passage turn into fact, and you're hanging on every detail and you're trying to squeeze every little bit out of that passage, out of every single sentence, that's not going to work either. That it's going to really slow you down, and then you're never really going to process what's the point of this passage. What's the passage really trying to say? It's never going to stop being this wall of text and this wall of facts. So thing number 1, this sounds really silly when I put it this way, don't underread, don't skim. Thing number 2, don't get obsessed with the details. Don't read with too much intensity. That can lead you off on the wrong path as well. And we'll illustrate this a little bit in the 3 examples today. Third thing, this starts to get to what you really should do. So if I'm saying don't underread, don't overread, what is it that we actually want you to do? We want you to really engage in the big picture. So in reading comprehension, we want you to think, okay, why is this paragraph here? So if you have a passage, for example, that's 3 paragraphs long, and the one we'll go through today is 3 paragraphs, we want you to stop at the end of every paragraph and go, why? What does the author want from me? What's the author's point of view? Why is this here? How does this fit into some broader structure or some broader kind of structure of the argument or sequence of ideas in this passage? If you don't lock into that big picture, it just turns into this wall of facts, or it turns into nothing. And then you're going to have a really, really tough time with the questions. So we want to get you to hone in on how is this passage logically structured. Same thing will be true of critical reasoning, and we'll give you examples in a minute. Fourth thing, this is one of the least sexy things here. If you're imprecise with your language, what do I mean by that? For those of you who've seen some of our critical reasoning videos or read our Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Critical Reasoning, you've heard me talk quite a bit about modifiers. What do I mean by that? So in critical reasoning especially, same is true of reading comprehension. I think it's easier to see on critical reasoning. Imagine that your conclusion on a critical reasoning passage is X is a solution to our problem. Now I can change just one word in that sentence and I've completely changed the passage. So instead of X is a solution, I could change that to X is a good solution. X is the only solution. X is the best solution. I've got 4 completely different conclusions. And now if you're going to go strengthen or weaken or find the assumption for that passage, we've completely changed it, because strengthening the idea that X is the only solution is logically totally different from strengthening the idea that it's the best solution or just a solution or a good solution. So a lot of this is precision of language. Now it's getting that in the right place. I'm not saying, oh, you've got to make sure you hang on every single word. That'll drive you crazy. That'll take an eternity. But where it matters, are you catching those little modifiers, those words that are going to change your scope, your strength, your magnitude, something, especially in the key parts of a passage, both critical reasoning and reading comp. And once again, we'll illustrate that in the examples today a little bit. Mistake number 5, falling in love. And what I mean by that, I see this all the time. People say, ooh. Answer choice A, I love it, that's it. And then they don't really read B, C, D, and E. Or they kind of look at A and go, no, that's not right, I know that. B, that's exactly what I was thinking. And then C, D, E, your mind's not really open, or you're not really paying attention to them. And even if you're kind of nominally going through the motions of doing process of elimination, something I see all the time is, I know A is not right. B, that's exactly what I was thinking. That's the answer. And then you're making excuses to cross these guys off, even though there might not be a good reason to eliminate them. So what I always want you to do, and we'll illustrate this today, I always want you to find 4 wrong answers, everything on verbal, sentence correction included, not one right answer. The reason is, when you think about how they make these difficult, how do the test writers make critical reasoning and reading comprehension in particular difficult? In a sense, this is an oversimplification. You can think of it as having 2 different dimensions of difficulty. One is hard language, fine. Second thing is, what if you never struggle with the language? What if you're a fantastic reader? Like you have no trouble getting through these passages, but you're still missing stuff. Why? Well, a lot of what happens is the test writers find some really creative, brilliant, wrong answer that sounds really, really good. So whatever you do, always find 4 wrong answers on your verbal, all 3 question types. Don't fall in love with something. Don't let yourself get biased and say, ooh, B was what I was thinking. This is great. Wipe that out of your head. Find the 4 mistakes. Last 2 things, these are kind of little bonuses. The 2 question types I actually see the most frequent mistakes on, or I'd say the most frequent kind of silly mistakes on: inferences. There's a lot of overthinking that happens on inference questions. We'll talk about that when we get to one of the examples. And the last thing is accept questions. There's actually a very, very simple, silly thing we can do to help you fix those up. We very, very commonly see careless errors on these last 2. So what I mean by these is not that these are the 2 hardest question types on critical reasoning, reading comprehension. I don't think they are. But I would argue that these are the 2 sources of the most egregious unforced errors, or errors on questions that are fundamentally easy for that particular test taker. And I'll give you a couple small ways to think about these that'll ensure that you never make a careless error on those 2. Okay, so that's the big picture. I'll leave this on the board the whole time. And apologies in advance, we still haven't quite figured out a great way, since our esteemed producer is in India, I'm here in the United States. We've never quite figured out a way to do split screen in a way that's elegant. So I'm going to be shrunken here as you guys go through this reading comprehension passage. We're going to take it 1 paragraph at a time, and I'm actually going to walk you through exactly the way I do it. And this is no gimmicks, no games. This is really what I do when I'm doing these. The only thing I'm going to do differently is I'm going to write a little bit more on the board than I normally would, just so that you can see what I'm thinking. But this will very much be exactly what I do when I take the test, exactly what we see in our most successful students, and exactly what we encourage our students to do. So I'll give you just a minute or two on that first paragraph, and then we'll come back and talk through it. And then we'll take it one paragraph at a time. So we'll give you just a minute. Okay, pretty short paragraph, so let's jump on in here. So what do I want you to get out of really any paragraph, but especially that first paragraph? I just want to know why. Why? What does the author want from me? What's the author's point of view? What's the point? How does this fit into some overall argument that's unfolding? Nice thing about this passage is right off the bat, you get this pretty clear statement of the author's point of view right in that first sentence. So Garvey sort of arrived at precisely the right historical moment. Now you know exactly right there, you've got a pretty clear idea of what the author's thesis is going to be going forward. So precisely the right historical moment. And he talks about kind of World War One or the end of World War One creates this ideal constituency for him. Simple enough. So there's some other details there. That's great. If you're having a hard time with them in general, this particular paragraph's not that tough. But in general, if you're having a hard time with a dense paragraph, that's actually totally fine as long as you can tell me, all right, why is this here? What does the author want from you? Very, very clear here. He's got this, the author, he or she has this thesis about Garvey arriving in the United States at precisely the right historical moment towards the end of World War One. It had created this ideal constituency for his ideas. Fantastic. We know where the author's taken us. Great. Now we can move on to paragraph two. Give you a couple minutes on paragraph two. This one gets a little bit more dense, but again, I want you to focus on, okay, why is this here, first and foremost? What's the author's purpose? Second, how does this fit into the first paragraph? How do those two things connect? Give you a couple minutes. Okay, hopefully that gave you guys enough time. So this one gets quite a bit more dense. Now there's all this detail, and we're talking, hey, there's some other guy, there's an anthropologist mentioned in here. We get some historical detail. You can drive yourself a little bit nuts. This is one of those paragraphs, by far easily not the GMAT's toughest work or densest paragraph. But you can already start to see how the detail obsession can drive you nuts here. So you could write down all this stuff about, oh, what happened when African Americans entered the army, talking about this anthropologist, all this stuff. That's not what I care about. What's this passage about? Yeah, pretty clear where the author's taking us. It's this whole idea of Marcus Garvey arriving at the precisely right historical moment. There was this ideal constituency for his ideas. So, what do I really care about here? So, okay, he's kind of describing what is paragraph 2 doing? Well, the purpose is kind of why is this the right moment? That's the big picture of why this is here. And what do we mean by that exactly? So what happened when African Americans returned from the war is there was this gap. As you look towards the bottom of that paragraph, the anthropologist talks about when a gap arises between expectations and reality, it can lead to these revitalization movements. There you go. So when there's a gap, so post World War I, there was a gap for African Americans between expectations and reality, and that can lead to revitalization movement. Okay, now what I always want you to do before you move on to the next paragraph, I always want you to think, okay, now how does this fit into the first paragraph? Am I clear about the links? Am I clear about where the author's trying to take me in the big picture? So sure, first paragraph, Garvey arrived at the right historical moment. There was this ideal constituency ready for him after the war. Now, why was that? Soldiers returned home, disillusioned, gap between what they expected and what actual reality was, and that can lead to these revitalization movements, these cultural revivals. Fantastic. All right. Now, before we move on to the third and final paragraph, one of the questions I get all the time, and it's a total legitimate question: how much notes should I take? Whenever I'm doing these with people, either with my students or in these webinars, you'll see me write quite a bit down. Now, depending on how you think, and I think we talked about this a little bit in that very first video of this series on how to become your own GMAT tutor, I think I mentioned, at least in brief, that note taking is different for everybody. It is different for everybody. This is a process that, for the most part, for me, I go through in my head. I don't always write all this down. The process, absolutely. The thing I really, really care about, and the thing we demand of our students, is stop at the end of every paragraph, make sure you can answer the question, why, why? What's the purpose? Why is the author writing this? And just as importantly, as you get to the second and subsequent paragraphs, how does it connect to the previous paragraphs? If you're doing that, I'm happy. If you're doing that with a clear head, you're not getting stuck in the details, I'm happy. That's going to be enough. Now, for some of you, writing more down really, really helps. Everybody's a little bit different. Some people are what's called kinesthetic learners. The more you write down, the better your brain engages. If that's the case for you, knock yourself out. Feel free to write more down. Now, just don't let it become that detail obsession where you're just writing down fact after fact after fact, and it just creates a mess. So keep yourself anchored in the big picture. I definitely want you to stop at the end of every paragraph. Minimal notes is what I think is optimal for most people. For some people, it's better to take none at all and just stop and think about these things. For other people, writing a little bit more is helpful. Figure out what works best for you. Everybody's different. Work on it. See what works best for you. And if you find that when you take more notes, you're worse, you're slower, you're actually missing those main idea questions, back off. Try to make sure your notes are more minimal if that's the case. If you find that note-taking distracts you on reading comprehension, great, don't take notes. Just make sure you're really focused on stopping at the end of every paragraph and thinking through, why is this here? What's the purpose? What does the author really want from me? If you miss a few details, no problem. It's going to be on the screen for you. They're not going to ask you about every detail. They're definitely going to ask you about the big picture. All right. Third and final paragraph. We'll give you a couple minutes to take a look at this one. Okay, hopefully that gave you guys enough time. Again, I'm not going to hang on every single word in this paragraph. I just want to know. All right, already got this nice kind of backdrop here of what happened in the first two paragraphs. Now I'm looking for how's the author kind of concluding sort of the overall ideas here. How does the argument kind of proceed? I think you can almost cut straight to that last sentence. Everything kind of builds up to that last thing. So sure, in the first sentence, some scholars have argued that Garvey created the consciousness, and then boom, you can hone right in on that last sentence. Garvey did not create the consciousness. It was pre-existing. He gave the consciousness its political expression. So basically, the idea here is that the consciousness already existed in the African American community. So Garvey didn't create it. Garvey just gave it political expression. Great. Now that fits like a glove with the rest of it. Even though you can get kind of lost, especially in that second paragraph, on a lot of the detail of, oh, the war and segregation and what happened. Sure, that's just a backdrop. What's the real point that the author is chasing? Garvey arrived at precisely the right historical moment. Why? There was this gap for African Americans between their expectations and their reality. That creates kind of this fertile breeding ground for revitalization movements in culture. And that consciousness, that revitalization movement, that breeding ground for this revitalization movement already existed in the community. Garvey didn't create it. Garvey just gave it political expression. Fantastic. Garvey was a little bit lucky, arrived at the right moment. That culture, that cultural revitalization was already happening for him when he arrived. Okay. By the way, for any of you interested in American history at all, I don't remember Marcus Garvey getting mentioned in any of my textbooks as a kid, but fascinating figure. Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Harlem Renaissance, fascinating stuff. If you got a couple hours on your hand, go read some stuff. Plenty of good stuff online about both of those guys. All right, let's go ahead and hit that first question. Now, most of the time on the GMAT, you're going to see some sort of primary purpose or main idea question. In general, even a lot of your questions that are not main idea or primary purpose questions tend to be contextual. You do occasionally, especially on the easier questions, you'll see things where they're asking you to pick on a certain detail, but much more likely you're going to see, hey, how did this detail fit into the overall context? So one of the objections I get from people sometimes is when I talk about making sure you invest wisely in the passage, make sure you understand the structure, purpose, author's point of view. So they say, oh, yeah, we can't spend time on that. I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. You don't have time not to do it. It's going to make you so much more efficient on your questions. So much more efficient. You're going to be faster in the long run. You're not going to miss easy questions. And again, if you haven't seen it, watch the first video in this 2018 series. We talk quite a bit about, actually the first two videos, talk quite a bit about how easy mistakes on questions can absolutely ruin your day. If you're missing the overall purpose of this, boy, you're going to have a hard time with those questions. And there's no amount of cherry picking details that can ever save you. And as you get to harder and harder questions, what's a 700 level question? Not details anymore. Those details are always going to be deeply contextual, harder to pull out. This is not the toughest of passages. As you get to the really, really tough ones, it's not so much that the language gets harder. It does. But that's actually not it so much as they're not going to ask you about details. They're going to ask you for synthesis. So if you cut corners here, if you skip these steps, that's where the wheels can come off on you. All right. Let's give you a minute to take a look at that first question. And we'll give you guys 2 minutes to kind of go through this. Feel free, for the live audience, feel free to spit out your answers at us. I'm kind of curious to see what you come up with here. All right. So a question is asking you, according to the passage, which the following contributed to Marcus Garvey's success? Now, this is actually kind of a big picture question because what's the whole passage about? How Marcus Garvey achieved success. It's about this whole idea that there was this precondition in the culture for revitalization movement and that led to his success. So in some sense, this is your main idea, primary purpose, big picture conceptual question. And hopefully if you were going through anything with us here, you're not struggling at all. Live audience seems to be doing great so far. That's fantastic. Answer choice A, he introduced cultural and historical consciousness to the African American community. No, he didn't introduce anything. That's the whole point here. That consciousness already existed when he showed up. B, believed enthusiastically in the traditional American success ethos. Now, that traditional American success ethos is mentioned in that second paragraph, but that's not really the heart of the passage. That's not why he achieved success. B's out. C, his audience had already formed a consciousness that made it receptive to his message. Exactly what we were just saying. Now, here's where I want you to be careful. What if I misread that? And I was like, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking. I did all this stuff, and I know what helped him achieve success. This whole idea of this whole thing was there for him when he arrived. Okay, cool. You don't want to think, I like this, I love it, it's the right answer, we still have two more left. It's on the same footing as if you didn't understand it at all. There's either eliminate or do not eliminate. There's nothing in between. Don't bias yourself here. You don't want to think, C's the answer. This is what I think is right. Even though I think we all agree that is what we think is right. I want you to wash that from your head and just say, I'm keeping it. I'm going to wash my brains and move on to answer choice D. His message appealed to critics of African American support for United States military involvement in the First World War. That is way off the reservation here because it's not about support for the involvement in the war. That definitely has nothing to do with how he achieved success. And E, he supported the movement to protest segregation that had emerged prior to his arrival. That may or may not be true. It's not really something that's emphasized at all in the passage, certainly not mentioned as a direct reason for his success. There you go, and your answer is C. And again, most of you know this. This is something we see all the times in the forums. Everybody uses process-elimination. Every good test prep person out there will encourage you to do so. Not a mystery to anybody. Just make sure your mind stays open. So make sure that you're not saying, ooh, I'm in love with C. That's where careless errors happen. And those careless errors can absolutely kill you. Okay, one last question on here before we move on, a little bit of critical reasoning. This is a nice inference question. So I'll give you a couple minutes, and then when we come back, we'll run through it quickly, and I'll also kind of explain where I see the most common errors on inferences. Go ahead and take a moment. And if you're watching us live, feel free to put up your answers. I'm curious to see how you guys do on this one before we jump back in. And we'll give you an extra minute or two until some of you have your answers come in. Please don't be shy. No judgment. Your answers are not saved anywhere. We won't see if you make a mistake. So please don't be shy. Okay, getting some really fun stuff in the live feed. All right, let's go ahead and jump in here. Here's the thing I see the most often on inference questions. Again, the careless error, the avoidable error that I see the most often from people who really kind of know what they're doing. They read it just fine. They're capable of understanding the answer, not getting obliterated by the language, miss it anyway. Why? What does the word inference mean? I think your dictionary definition or your textbook definition is it's something that was not stated in the passage. So it's going to be something that wasn't directly mentioned, but was indirectly said, right? That's what an inference means. Now, you can massively overthink that and get yourself into huge, huge trouble. I'm not sure that that's where any of the errors are coming from on this particular question. I don't think that's what makes this one difficult. But it's something I see all the time where people go, hey, that's too obvious. The right answer is too obvious. I can't pick that. It said that directly. Hey, that's probably your right answer. You rearrange a couple words, now it's no longer directly stated. Now it's something where you have to draw an inference. Even if you don't have to work very hard for that inference, rearrange a couple words, and guess what, guys? That's an inference. So again, the mindset here, talk about process elimination, not falling in love. What does that mean? Find 4 wrong answers. On inference questions, always think, find the 4 things that are not supported by the passage. That 5th one is your right answer, even if it just seems so dumb and obvious, you don't want to pick it. Okay, so actually some stuff here that's pretty darn tempting. So let's come back quickly in that passage, that first sentence. So the question is referencing sort of what the scholars mentioned in that highlighted text, first sentence, 3rd paragraph. Some scholars have argued that Garvey created the consciousness from which he built that great revitalization movement. So fantastic, right? So it's saying that some scholars argue that Garvey created all of this consciousness. So what the question is asking you for is it can be inferred that the scholars believe which the following to be true. It's got to be something to do with that idea that Garvey created the consciousness. Now, A, revitalization resulted from the political activism. Okay, that is connected to what's said in the 2nd paragraph and really in some ways the 1st, but that's not what the scholars are arguing in that part of the sentence or in that part of the paragraph, not A. B, Garvey had to change a number of prevailing attitudes in order for his mass movement to find a foothold. Well, so if he's kind of helping, so the scholars believed that he built this consciousness. Now, the overall passage is arguing he didn't. The scholars are arguing that he built this consciousness. In order to build a consciousness, change people's minds about things, make people think differently, yeah, you're changing their minds, I guess. Sure. So of course you're changing some prevailing attitudes if you're building a consciousness of some sort of movement. And you could argue in B that it seems too obvious. Maybe you might argue that, and maybe you're not tempted to pick it. But again, inference questions, make sure you're saying I'm going to find the 4 wrong answers, not the one right one. I'm going to keep B. C, the prevailing sensibility of the African American community provided the foundation of Marcus Garvey's political appeal. Well, yeah, I mean, that's not so far off from what the passage as a whole is saying, but that has nothing to do with what the scholars are arguing in that sentence. The scholars are arguing that Garvey built this himself, so not C. D, this is the tricky one. I think I'm surprised we're not seeing more of this on the live feed, but I think D is kind of tempting. Marcus Garvey hoped to revitalize consciousness of cultural and historical identity. Well, what the scholars are saying is that Garvey created this consciousness, not that he hoped to revitalize it. Just that one word. I talked a little bit about modifiers, language imprecision, critical reasoning, reading comprehension, both. That change in one word. Now, if revitalize had been changed to create, hey, now not so bad. Garvey hoped to create consciousness of cultural and historical identity. Scholars do seem to believe that, right? Now, they're not saying that Garvey hoped to revitalize it because revitalize implies that there was already something there. And in that part of this passage, the scholars are arguing that Garvey created it himself, not D. Tempting. I'm actually surprised we didn't get more D's in our live audience. E, the goal of the mass movement that Marcus Garvey helped bring into being was to build on the pride and unity. Once again, that's not what the scholars are arguing at all. The scholars are arguing that Garvey created that movement, created that consciousness. So not E, and you're left with B. Okay, we're running a little short on time here. We got about 20 minutes. Here's what I think we should do here. We have 2 critical reasoning questions that we've chosen. And we're not going to have time for both of them, unfortunately. I apologize. I've been talking a little bit too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut straight to an accept question. And the one we're going to skip is another inference question, since we just covered one on this reading comp passage. And again, that's the one we were going to do. And what we'll do instead is we'll put this in as a question of the day, probably next week. Or at the very least, I'll write up an explanation of it on the forum and link it in the kind of the main thread where we have this list of videos for this series. One of my very, very favorite passages is actually from the LSAT, but it's one of the ones where I see the most errors of, well, that answer is dumb and obvious. It said that. That's stupid. I'm not going to pick it. It's too obvious. I see that mistake probably from about 50 or 60% of the people that do it. I almost see it more often from people who are great at critical reasoning than I see from people who aren't as good at it. Really, really common for people to slip into that trap on inferences. This is too obvious. Get rid of it. Don't fall into that. An inference could be something you work really hard for. You've got to really think through a bunch of layers of logic. Or it could be a really, really simple restatement, or it could be anywhere in between. Keep that in mind as you keep doing those inference questions. And remember, on GMAT Club, we have tags for everything. If you just want to click on, you see an inference question, you want more of them, go ahead and click on that tag for inferences, and you'll see plenty more of them. Get yourself a little bit of practice. All right, so Shovik, if you could please, let's cut ahead to the tobacco industry question. And this is an accept question. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to start working through this, and then I'll talk about kind of the big picture of what I want you to think in terms of the accept questions, and a very, very small little thing that can help you avoid that careless error that can be so damaging. We'll give you about 2-3 minutes on this one. And the same as usual here, please don't be shy about putting your answers up. Looks like the crowd is behind A. If you disagree, please don't be shy. I'll give you just another 20 seconds or so. All right, great. We're seeing a little bit of dissent, makes me happy. And again, thank you so much to anybody who's willing to see a whole bunch of answers go up on a live feed, and then you disagree with it, and you think you might be wrong, and you tell us your answer anyway. Thank you. I really appreciate it, because it really helps me to know how much struggle is happening out there. And those of you who are going against the crowd may well be right. Let's see. So here's what I want you to do on accept questions. It's a really, really small thing. Anytime you see an accept question, I want you to write. I want this looking in the eye, even if you're not really a note taker, even if that's not really your thing. Like, I'm not necessarily a huge note taker by nature. I don't write a ton down. Usually I do it when I'm trying to show you my thinking on the board. I don't do a ton of it. I do some. Some people write even less than I do. If you are somebody who doesn't write anything down on your page and that's what works best for you, cool. This is one of the few things I want on your page every single time. Any accept question, cross out anything that blank. Every single time, whenever you see an accept question, why? Here's the thing that tends to happen. And I've done this. I've actually done this live with students more times than I can count. Where student will kind of be going through and I'm listening to them talk through their logic. And let's say that, let's say this is, we're going to cross out, in this case, you're going to cross out anything that's going to explain, right? That's going to explain this discrepancy. So let's say you're going through and let's say you look at A. Now this is not, I'm not using the actual answer choices here, just illustrating with an example. Let's say you look at A and you're like, yeah, that explains it. That's out. And then you look at B and you're like, I don't know. I have no idea what B says. My brain hurts. Cool, keep it. C, oh yeah, that explains it. That's out. D, I understand it. I don't think it explains it, but maybe, I don't know. I'm gonna keep it. E, it explains it. That's out. And let's say choosing between B and D is really, really hard for you. And let's say either because they're hard to understand or you just don't see how they connect and you're not quite sure which one explains and which one doesn't. You're like, okay, which one explains? Which one explains? You go back and forth, B and D, B and D. Does B explain? Does D explain? Crap. Does D explain? Wait a minute, if I think about it this way, let me read the passage a little bit more again. And now time's going off the clock and that's cool. Sometimes these are hard, you gotta do that. Which one explains it? And then you're like, I got it. B explains it. B's the answer. I'm picking B, off I go. But no, that's actually the one you should cross out. And it's actually really easy when the accept questions start getting difficult, or when the answer choices start getting difficult to connect. It's really easy to find yourself choosing the thing you should cross out. So make sure that this, cross out anything that blank is looking you in the eye. All right. And I'll spoil a surprise, the answer here is not B. Let's come back to the passage just a little bit. So we're looking for anything, we're going to cross out anything that kind of explains the discrepancy here, explains that simultaneous increase in tobacco sales and decrease in the number of adults who smoke. So what are kind of the two pieces of the discrepancy? Whenever you have a discrepancy or paradox type question, you should always have two statements. If you're somebody who writes notes down, this is a good thing to have looking you in the eye. Just so you're totally clear, make sure you nail that language. If you're not clear about what exactly that discrepancy is, really easy to make an error. What do we have in this case? Total amount of tobacco sold by tobacco farmers has increased. Cool. Number of adults who smoke has decreased. A couple things jump out at me here. Number of adults who smoke. Now, obviously, there's just that difference between talking about the amount of tobacco, so total amount of tobacco sold, versus the number of people who smoke. But actually, I'm being sloppy there too. It's not number of people. It's specifically number of adults who smoke. All right. And by the way, one other thing here, this is all in the backdrop of in the United States. So this has been restricted. It's in the United States this year. So this is not talking about anything other than just tobacco sales and the number of smokers in the United States. So let's go through these, see which ones actually explain that discrepancy. So A, during this year, the number of women who have begun to smoke is greater than the number of men who have quit smoking. Wait a minute. Okay, so we know that the total number of adults who smoke has decreased. It's in the passage. It's gospel. It's a fact. And they're saying, well, okay, there's more women who have begun to smoke, so increase in women smokers, and that's larger than the number of men who have quit. Yeah, so that would suggest that there's an increase in smokers, but what about the number of women who've quit? That's not getting addressed here. That doesn't seem to me like it would explain anything. So let's hang on to A for now. We're crossing out things that explain. I don't think A explains, or at least I can't figure out how it explains. We'll keep it. B, number of teenage children who have begun to smoke this year is greater than the number of adults who quit. Okay. Again, that's where that precision of language, thing number 4, not number of people. Make sure you're catching that it's the number of adults. So yeah, this would absolutely explain it. So we could have the number of adults who smoke decrease, but the overall number of smokers is increasing because teenagers are taking it up. This explains, cross out anything that explains, B. And I really do this when I'm doing these questions on my own, if I'm taking the test, not being gimmicky here. I'm going to keep looking at this because I don't trust myself. I've made this mistake a bunch of times, often embarrassingly in front of people. So I'm always looking back at this. I cross anything that explains, B's gone. C, during this year, the number of non-smokers who have begun to use chewing tobacco or snuff is greater than the number of people who've quit smoking. Okay, smokers down, cool. But if people are using tobacco in different forms, chewing tobacco, that's going to explain. Cross out anything that explains. Cool. D. And by the way, on C, I think the temptation for some people, well, wait a minute, chewing tobacco is irrelevant. It's not mentioned. Try not to be that mechanistic about saying no mention of chewing tobacco, it's irrelevant. Sure it is. Think about how the logic connects. You bet that would explain it, because that means more tobacco gets sold. It's not saying the total amount of cigarettes sold, total amount of tobacco sold. We're looking for something that indicates how we could increase the amount of tobacco sold, even though smokers are going down. More tobacco used for other things, good. That's going to explain it. C's out. D, the people who have continued to smoke consume more tobacco per person than they did in the past. Sure. Fewer smokers, lower number of adults smoking, more tobacco itself sold. If every smoker is just smoking more, we're going to sell more tobacco. And E, more of the cigarettes made in the United States this year were exported to other countries than was the case last year. And there you go, that backdrop in the United States this year. We can absolutely explain this discrepancy if they're just exports. And I don't think anybody's going to get fooled by that. You're business school types, so you're thinking about imports and exports. E is a pretty easy one to eliminate. All right, we are going to end just a little bit early today because it's going to take us long enough if we try to do one more critical reasoning passage. Just to summarize a little bit, these are all of the things. So what was today's session all about? It's about the things that we see, the most common mistakes we see that I would call technique errors. And one of the things that some of you have probably seen me talk about on the forums, in some sense, there are two different things that can cause you trouble in reading comp and critical reasoning. And to some degree, sentence correction. That's a little bit of a different animal. So two things that can cause you trouble. One is if you just have a hard time with the reading. If you read a passage, read a paragraph, read a sentence, you don't understand what it says, fundamentally, there's no amount of test prep techniques or trickery or gimmicks. There's nothing we can do to make you fundamentally better at understanding what the sentence says or what the passage says or what the paragraph says. There is such a thing as reading skill. You can get better at it. You can develop reading skill. Tons of people on GMAT Club that we've seen over the years that come in with really, really low scores, scoring 10, 12, 17 on verbal, get their way up into the 20s, 30s, 40s. It happens. Those people who do that, if it takes them years, in a lot of cases, they are getting better at reading in English fundamentally. It can happen, takes a lot of work. It's so inspiring when you see people do it. We've had students do it. Tons of our friends on GMAT Club have pulled it off. We need to separate out a little bit. Here's technique. Here's things that can help you be better at the test. Here's test prep techniques versus here's your reading skill. Plenty of resources on GMAT Club. If you're interested in just getting some good things to read, there's a great thread on books that you can read in English that people have found helpful over the years. Not about reading, just good, hard, entertaining novels, nonfiction, biographies. There's another thread about periodicals. Find my ultimate guide to reading comprehension on the forum. There's links to two of those threads if you want to take a look at some of that stuff. So be honest with yourself. If the reading itself is an issue, work on your reading skills. What I've identified here are the things that prevent you from reaching what you're capable of, given what your reading skills are. If you're a pretty good reader, but your scores are worse than pretty good, these are the things that we find are the most likely, not the only things, most likely to be causing the problem of seeing you not reach your ceiling, not reach sort of your potential. And that potential is determined in the short run by what your reading skills are. So make sure you're not skimming. Make sure you're not obsessing over details. Don't let the paragraphs turn into fact, 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 fact. It's not going to get you anywhere. You got to spend time kind of thinking, what is the logical structure of this passage? Critical reasoning and reading comp both. Notice what we did here on critical reasoning. Simple passage, nice kind of discrepancy paradox kind of question. Thing one, thing two, I've identified the logic of the passage. A little bit of backdrop. Here's two things that seemingly contradict. If you want to go back to our videos from 2017, did a couple of videos. I think I started with just strength and weaken and assumption questions. You'll see us break down those kind of passages and say, all right, I got to get to the heart of it. Get me to the conclusion. Those are going to be up on the GMAT Club YouTube channel. Check those out if you're not clear what I mean about identifying the logical structure of a critical reasoning passage. Go find those videos on critical reasoning from 2017. We'll get into it a little bit there. Fourth thing, language and precision. Even if you're fundamentally a good reader, don't let those little modifiers slip past, or those little tiny things. Total amount of tobacco sold, number of adults, not number of people. Those little details can change everything for you. Fifth thing, don't fall in love. We talked about that a ton today. Always find 4 wrong answers, not 1 right answer. Inferences, don't Don't let yourself overthink what that word literally means. The standardized test definition of inference in a practical sense is not the same as the real world one. Inference in real life, again, not stated directly on an actual GMAT question. You just want to think, let me find the 4 things that are not supported by the passage. If that 5th one is super, super obvious, great, it's my right answer. And accept, very, very small thing. Don't let yourself make that careless error of choosing the thing that explains in the end. Make sure you have written down on your page, looking you in the eye, no matter how much you dislike writing things down, no matter how little of a note taker you are, let it look you in the eye, cross out anything that blank, fill in the blank with whatever that question's actually asking you for. All right, so one final reminder, please, please hit that subscribe button, whether you're watching us live, whether you're not watching us live. We're going to be doing some fun stuff. I hear rumors that our esteemed producer has even more ideas. Like I said, we're going to start in April. Our next little series is going to be, we're going to get some really entertaining alumni and current students from top business schools talking about what their experiences were really like, telling us the things that many of them have told me personally over beers by about the 3rd or 4th beer. We're going to get folks who are willing to do that on camera, live on YouTube with us. So that's coming up in April. Hit that subscribe button. You'll get updates. And we will be back here next week, same time. Video number 4 in our Developing a Winning GMAT Mindset series. And we will see you next week. Thank you so much, everybody.